Okay, welcome everyone to the Global Visions Forum of the year 2023. My name is Max Talber. I'm the founder and chairperson of the Global Visions Association. Our aim is to generate discussion and offer solutions to how the world can be made more just and equal, especially from a global perspective. And we are also especially interested in different global societal and political visions and solutions regarding all of this. For the past months, we have been focusing on the history of the philosophy of justice, since justice is a key value for us. At the beginning of next year, we'll focus on those solutions we already feel we have when it comes to making the world more just and equal, and those are human rights, democracy, and the welfare state. The long-term aim regarding these blog texts is to create a data bank where the question, how can the state of the world be improved, is answered in a holistic and comprehensive way. And this could also lead to book projects, for instance, in the future. And meanwhile, we will continue to organize events and record podcast episodes, as well as campaign for those global solutions that we feel would benefit humanity most today. So the first item on this year's Global Visions Forum is a lecture held by Risto Marjomaa of the University of Helsinki, in which he looks into the present state of the world at the end of the year 2023. This lecture is then followed up by a panel discussion in which we discuss how the state of the world can best be improved today. And we will surely in this talk also touch upon some of the themes that Risto brings up in his lecture. So it's great to have you here once again. I hope you enjoy the evening today, and please, Risto, the stage is yours.
Thank you. It must be said that my first lecture today was at 10 o'clock and now it's running over 6, so let's hope my English is going to last with me. This is the second time I have been asked to make this presentation, and that made me something of a dilemma, because as a historian, we usually see the cause and effect running for years, perhaps decades, for anything that happens. So there is not that much different between what has been happening, the roots of what has been happening this year, than the roots that happened last year. And this means that my representation will be partially the same as before, because nothing has changed so quickly. I could have, of course, done differently and simply told you about what has happened this year, but then it would have been more of a list of events, not their background. I could also have expected that everybody has seen the last year's representation, but that again wouldn't have worked, and I can't even remember what I was talking about last year. So we will now be partially doing the same thing we did before. Last year I started with a map of a United Nations resolution. In that case it was the resolution for condemning Russian invasion of Ukraine. And my idea behind that map was to show you how our world seems to be sliding back into a Cold War division. Those who voted against this resolution were Russia, of course, and only a few other countries. And thus it might have been seen that Russia doesn't have that much support. But actually, in a voting like that, in UN resolution voting, you are voting for something to pass. So it's not only voting against, but also if you refrain from voting, that you are actually against. It's a diplomatic nicety to refrain and not vote against. The end result is the same. If you don't vote for, you are not supporting the resolution. So in that last year's slide, if you took all the states which were painted red, against, or yellow, that means refraining, you could see a map which was eerily like the Cold War map, with Europe, the West, Americas being on one side, condemning the Russian invasion, whereas Asia was on the other, and Africa in between, roughly divided into two, which is rather close to what we saw during the Cold War era. Okay, now a year has passed and I have a different map. It's again a resolution, a United Nations resolution 2 months ago. This time the resolution was about demanding a ceasefire in the Gaza war. And as you can see, everything has changed within a year. The Western hope for condemnation of Russia, a global condemnation of Russia, did not hold very well. It has now evaporated due to this new war, which has been pretty catastrophic for Western diplomacy, for Western global views. This time, the Reds are United States and a few of its closest allies in Middle Europe and in the Americas. Even if you add yellows, you only get half of Europe, including Finland, and some countries here and there. By far, most of the world were in favor of demanding ceasefire in the Gaza war. So whatever goodwill United States and its allies, close allies, were able to gain worldwide during the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year ago has now seemingly evaporated, at least in the United Nations, because this time United States and its allies are mainly being seen to be in the wrong by most of the countries in this world. As you can see, almost all of Asia and Africa, even South America, and even countries in Europe were in favor of condemning war, of demanding a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. So things do change. Is this a proof that there is not a new Cold War after all? It could be. It could also be proof that this, our modern Cold War, the new Cold War or Cold War 2.0 is a different kind, in which you have the main opponents, this time Russia and United States, as last time, well, Soviet Union. But for the rest of the world, there is no longer a similar division between two great alliances. China, very happily, stays outside, supporting the United Nations when it suits it, and being able to avoid condemnation. For China, this has been a very good 2 years in its international politics, as all the focus has been between United States and Russia, the two other great powers in the world, allowing China to kind of slip under the radar. And that's about it for that. Let's see if I can turn this forward. Yes, that was easy. Okay, like last year, we will start with the environment. But I have a slightly different focus this year, starting with the idea of imperialism. Post-colonial world is a term meaning that we actually never really left the world of empires, although they fell by 1960, so around 60 years ago. But in many respects, the world system is still more or less the same as then. The West is still leading, not only in economy, but also in politics. It still regards its ideologies, the ideology of democracy, human rights, and so forth, as global. It demands that other parts of the world follow its rule, that it has somehow the right to say how we should be living in this world also to other countries, outside countries. And this is something which developed during the imperial era with the basically rather racist assumptions that what comes from West is somehow better than what other countries have. As an example, 2 years ago, when the Taliban guerrillas were able to pull down the Western-supported and rather corrupt Afghani government, and they created their own government in its place, they got very harshly, and to my mind rightly, condemned by their policies, especially against women. But on the other hand, I think at least 2 times now, perhaps more, when there has been condemnation of the Afghani government in press releases in Kabul, the prime minister or somebody else, usually not foreign minister, or somebody else has made the counter argument that what is this has to do with you? What right do you have to come into my country to tell me how we run our country? And although I do not agree with the Taliban policies, I think they are very reprehensible, very unfortunate. It is not a bad question. What gives right for the West to demand, even government like the Taliban government, that it should not pursue the politics it seems right, governing its own country? Where does this right come from? And this perhaps is something which we are supposed to discuss today, this idea that democracy and human rights should be for everybody, like it or not. You either are a Democrat or you cry and are a Democrat. You have to be, which is not really a principle of democracy to start with. But there are other factors here as well. Western consumption levels, the way we live here in Finland and elsewhere in the West, cannot be sustained by ourselves. There are no such resources in this world. We are overliving the resources by far. I think it's now already early August or so when we have used all the renewable resources for that year. So we are getting worse and worse in that. We can only sustain our living standards by other people being poor. They could not get rich as us. Africans cannot have the same living standards as we have, nor the Asians, nor even South Americans, because it's impossible. There are no such resources. In order for them to be able to higher their resource levels, we should probably lower ours, but we are not going to do that. And this is the system that was created during the imperialist period. The empires, although in the West, some of the empires, especially Great Britain, seems to still be claiming that it was a benevolent empire and that Western imperialism has created something good. I have never seen anything good in Western imperialism. I have yet to find, I have studied it for decades now, but I have yet to find a single argument in defense that there was something that was inherently good in imperial times for the colonies themselves. Anything at all. All the arguments usually made in favor, for example, that the West created political systems or created economy, they are completely false, and they only tell that people who are making them don't really know what they are talking about. They have not really tried to find out how it was really like. It was not like that. It was simply taking resources from these countries in order to increase our own production level and to make our own living standards higher. And we gave nothing back. And thus it was maintained with force. After the fall of the empires, force has not been needed in the same levels because the economies of these former colonies, or at least most of them, are still so tightly tied to our own world that they cannot get out of it. They cannot change it anymore. Some of them do. Countries like South Korea or Taiwan, which, by the way, never were Western colonies, they were Japanese colonies, actually, which does have some meaning. Japan wasn't colonizing them in the same manner. But anyway, for most of the colonies, it has been impossible for making this change. It's very easy to see if you Google maps of the colonial period, let's say a world map of the colonial period, and then you compare it to almost anything in our modern time. Economy, literacy, human rights, women's rights, almost anything at all. It's almost the same. So the world created at that time is still here in many ways. Another result, a very derogatory result of these times, was that we in the Western world lost sight of what sustainable development is, because we did not have to do it anymore. Any time before in history, wherever you have been in the world, you have been forced to take into account your environment, because otherwise you will destroy it by erosion and then you will die. There are examples, in fact, sadly, rather many examples of civilizations which have fallen because they were unable to keep up with the changes in their environment. They were destroying it. Like Maya cultures in the Yucatan Peninsula in modern Mexico, which is perhaps the most famous case. There were other reasons for its fall, but let's not go into that. But nowadays, all this can be moved outside our vision. The degradation happens mostly in the Third World War countries. The mines there are still, in many cases, strip mines, which means that they are polluting their surroundings, but it doesn't matter to us because it's there. We don't see it. We don't feel it. The same with agriculture, which is destroying, in many cases, the local landscape. When I was in Malawi 20 years ago, there was actually a United Nations official, agricultural official, who told me that Malawi is now so dependent on the production of maize, corn with the Americans, that if there is a good or a bad year for maize in world prices, the Malawians suffer. Because if it's a bad year, of course, they will have lesser production for themselves. But even if it's a good year, it means that the prices go lower and they can't afford fertilization. It's only the average years in which they can still maintain something of stability with their production levels. That was 20 years ago, but I see no reasons to think that it would have changed much since, at least to better. So resources, pollution, even global warming. In the end, the global warming, you could say, is something which is now coming back to haunt us. We can't ignore it anymore, as we have ignored the loss of resources in the world and the pollution, because, well, it's the world, it's global climate, and it will affect us as well. But let's see, I'm still not very optimistic that we will be able to solve it, although humankind has always been rather good at somehow blundering forward from crisis to crisis, but always surviving. But the problem with the global warming, well, basically it does this. It affects different parts of the world in a different manner. It was realized already on early 1970s. There was a meeting in Stockholm in 1970 in which, for the first time, the climatologist, I'm not sure if that's a word, presented the warning that something like this will happen in the future unless we do something. And that's 60 years ago, no, 53 years ago. If we compare to that, not that much has happened, and there is a problem between the rich and the poor states. Here in the West, people are looking at Tesla, electric cars, and different forms of technological solutions to global warming, which could lower our levels of pollution very impressively if they are going to work. But then we completely forget that there's never going to be electrical cars in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, because there is no electricity to be had. They don't have a network in which you could maintain electric cars. So if it really happens that the use of traditional combustion engine cars will stop, as is quite likely to happen because of the logic of how economy works, it will be a crisis in the poor countries. What are they going to use for transportation then? They can't go into Tesla. They can't even find electricity for very simple things in many of the poorest countries. So it would be completely hopeless for them to pick up electric cars. So for them, the real solution is that we should lower consumption. And this should be the way forward. And this is what they are quarreling all the time. In fact, they are at the moment quarreling about it in Dubai. There is now a conference in Dubai, I think Dubai, somewhere in the Arab Emirates, concerning this. So for us, this is kind of okay, the idea of a global economy in which containers are used to transport things all over the world. But this container economy is never going to make a difference in balancing world living standards. It's just maintaining them as they are. If there would have been something happening, it would surely have happened in 60 years. It's a long time. But after 60 years, for many former colonies, their living standards are now worse than they were at the moment of independence. They haven't been going upward, they are going downward still, while our living standards have risen greatly. So the difference between the two has been growing. This is more what they have to expect from global warming. This picture is from India from last summer. They had the record heat in many parts of India, and thousands of people die of heat because, of course, poor people can't afford any cooling mechanisms in their homes. And finally here, you can see that although there has things been done against global warming. There have been technological changes, and they have even been rather impressive during the last few years. They have been able to slowly pull down our use of energy in the world. But all that is here. All this is still the traditional non-renewable energy use in the world. So, if things are going to happen in this respect, they should be happening in a much larger scope than is currently the case. Okay. Then into something which is more to do with politics, although it ties up with the world environment and especially its economy. The Chinese economic rise. This is something I dealt with already last year, and it hasn't changed anywhere. China is challenging the world system in many ways. China is challenging the idea of Western-led world system. Actually, from economic point of view, it has already destroyed it because most of world trade is now not going through anymore through the Atlantic. Atlantic is not the central of the world anymore, as it was during the colonial period and all the way until the end of 20th century. It has now shifted into Pacific. The main trade lines in the world are now between China and United States, no longer between Europe and United States as used to be. So from economic point of view, yes, global balance is changing, but there is also something which is more sinister from our point of view. During the Cold War era, the original Cold War era, we had two political systems which were competing against each other. The Western idea of liberal democracy, not so democratic during the Cold War, but the ideology was democratic, against the communist ideology of Soviet Union. And that was not actually in the end that hard of a challenge because communism failed by itself. It could not produce what it promised. Its economy failed. Granted, partly it failed because of the great competition, because it had to use so much of its resources in military power, because its economy was only about 1/5, it and its allies, 1/5 of what had the Western world. The Western world was always winning this war. But in the end, Soviet Union fell from within. It could not make its system work. And this doesn't mean that there could not be a socialist economy working. It just means that Soviet Union was not this. It failed. So not much of a challenge there. But China is quite different. China has succeeded where Soviet Union failed. It has become this second largest economy in the world, and it's still catching up with the United States, although it's not liberal democracy. The rather convenient and snug claim in the West, especially after the Cold War in 1990s, was that in order to become a welfare state, you have to have democracy, because democracy creates stability, stability creates economic growth, and then economic growth creates welfare. And thus everybody should be democratic. All the world should be democratic. And it will be democratic at some point. But China is now challenging this. The Chinese slogan is that you just simply leave democracy out of it. Stability creates economic growth. Economic growth creates welfare. Welfare creates stability. You don't need democracy in anything. You just follow the party rule and things will go right. And they have been going right. So, again, like with the Taliban, it's certainly not my choice of a political organization. There have been also some rather horrific sides of it, especially it's dealing with its own minorities. But that doesn't mean that it's not a challenge, it is. I have sometimes given the choice to my, well, not really a choice, presented the choice to my students that if I would now pay you 10,000 euros for not voting again, ever, would you take it? How many would you take it? 10,000 euros for not voting ever again. How much does your vote actually mean in Finnish politics? The vote of one person. I think very many people would take that. And if you take that, then democracy is in trouble. It means that political freedoms is not at the top of your agenda. Material factors are more important. And at least for now, the Chinese case seems to be pointing this way. There is no democracy movement in China. There are only a few people. There is 1 billion people living in that country. I don't think there is going to be a democracy movement in a country of that scale unless there are tens of millions of people in the street. Even that will be in Finnish perspective only a few hundred. Because it's such a big country, 1 billion people. It's quite pointless to be pinpointing this and that single case of somebody who is trying to defend political rights or freedom in China. Single people doesn't matter in a state of 1 billion people. So there is no challenge at all for the Chinese political system at the moment. Everything changes. Perhaps if I will be making this talk next year, things have changed. I doubt it, but everything changes. Nothing remains the same in the world. But at the moment, no, I cannot see any kind of opposition, workable opposition in China. And this also is a very lucrative model for authoritarian rule everywhere else. It's a model that has been taken up by increasing number of countries in Asia and especially in Africa. That, hey, this is a great option. No elections mean that I cannot be put out of power. It also means that in our country there is this division of, let's say, 20 to 100 different nations, and they are all competing each other. If we don't have elections, we don't have any trouble, but we will have economic growth, which creates stability. Countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, partly Kenya as well, South Africa in some instances, many African countries are now leaning towards this idea that they could perhaps make better with China as they ever could with the West, because the West always only took and never gave. China promises to give, it's untrustworthy, they don't believe it, but at least a promise is better than no promise. And the political system could be seen to fit better any authoritarian rule in Africa. So it's a real challenge. China is probably the greatest practical challenge for the ideal of Western democracy that there has ever been. Because never before there has been a challenge coming from a success story. China is, of course, also taking part in competition over global resources, increasingly. And as noted, our Western world is based on the idea that those resources belong to us. In the European case, especially African resources. And there has been much anger among European politicians and also business life for the Africans now turning towards China instead. It says that the Africans are being ungrateful for the Europeans, and this doesn't go well down in Africa, because the way they see us is that we are greedy and violent, and we are keeping them down. And there is this great discrepancy between the way European Union wants to portray itself, like our representatives going to Africa to talk about democracy, good government. That doesn't go down with African leaders, because they don't see Europe as a place of, well, they see Europe as a place of good government and democracy, but not for outsiders. It's only for Europe itself, inside. We are not really exporting anything. I can't figure out a single example where we would have even really tried to export these ideals. I don't know how it would happen. Democracy is not for exportation anyway, because it's something you need to want for yourself. And thus there has been much bitterness in Africa against Europeans for this. that we are still talking quite the opposite than what we are doing. Whereas with the case of the Chinese, they have a very different kind of morality, again, not my choice, that we don't care what you do in your country if you don't what we do in our country. It is a morality of a sort, actually. It is a moral point of view that you can live your life as you want, and you should live my life as I want. But of course, it's very convenient for any authoritarian rulers that, for the case of China, you are not going to vote against us in case of the Uzbek minority, the persecution of Uzbek minority, and we are not going to vote against you in anything. But from the point of view of African and many Asian, even some South American rulers, this is much more predictable. This is something which you can use. It's a deal. You make that, we made this, and you can trust that this deal holds, because both sides gain in equal measure. Whereas with the West, you never know. There has been, during this year and the last, a lot of discussion in African countries, especially, that they should withdraw their savings from American and European banks, because you never know when they are going to bring sanctions against us. It's our money. What right do they have to make sanctions against our money? So we shouldn't use their bank. We should use banks like this, Chinese banking system, because you can trust that Chinese are not going to do that. There was much discussion of that last year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions the West made against Russia. These sanctions are mainly by the West itself. They are not international sanctions. They are sanctions made by the Western countries. And Western countries have all the right to do so, because we have all the right to defend Ukraine against invasion. But by making these sanctions to hurt also third parties, this is something which they cannot understand, and this is something which makes them think that we should try to invest our money somewhere. We never can trust the Westerners. And that's a problem as well. Here is a list of Chinese foreign investment, the main centers of it during the past 2 years, I think. And as you can see, although it started out as an idea of a new Silk Road through Central Asia, it's now worldwide. One of the main beneficiaries being Argentina on the other side of the world. The Chinese strategy, economic and political strategy, seem to be that they push where there is softness, wherever it is. They have a very pragmatic use for their increase of power, that almost anything goes at this moment. They are now competing with the West, mainly with the United States, worldwide. It's no longer in some parts of the world. Here you have Chinese exports in the port of Dubai, which has becoming quite of a link for Chinese trade for the Middle East and Africa. So there are other countries. There is another example of that also, but I will mention it when I come to that slide. Did I say everything? Well, more or less. Let's go forward. As noticed, part of the text of these slides is the same as last year. Okay, Second Cold War. What kind of Cold War? Certainly these two, more or less, but what else? Even in that first Cold War, it never was a world divided in two. It always was a world divided in three. There was also the grouping of neutral countries, and some of these countries were very powerful, like India. In Europe, for example, Yugoslavia was an important country. So even in that time, it was not a division of the world into two, nor is it now. But it's obvious that if we are now going to have another Cold War, it will be much more complicated still. Because now you have kind of 3 or 4 main players. Russia is still a great power in a sense because of its military, not its economy, but it still has very strong military. It hasn't done very well in the Ukrainian war, but it's still a nuclear power. It still has a very impressive network of satellites. It has worldwide capacity to use its power one way or another. So yes, it's still on the run, although it is clearly below the level of United States and China. And then there is European Union. It's still to be seen whether European Union is going to be a center of anything or not. European Union was, in its time, partially created by the delusions of grandeur of France. France wanted to make itself big again, using Europe in between Soviet Union and United States. From the point of view of French foreign policies in 1950s and 60s, Charles de Gaulle, the idea was that first we get rid of Soviet Union and then of United States. So in France and some other European countries, those traditional big countries, they still see themselves as an outsider, as a third power. But unhappily for the French and their friends, other European countries do not see it that way. For example, Finland nowadays is very close to the United States. So European Union is kind of in between. There is, again, intensification of great power rivalry. There was this rather fallacious belief in 1990s. Nowadays everybody say that everybody believed. No, I didn't, and I still recall that time in our university here in Helsinki, not very many people were, at least in the historical department of humanities, was undersigning this idea that West has won the Cold War. It was obvious that from the ruins of a Cold War there will be others, because the real problems in the world, the troubles between states, inequality and so forth, they haven't gone anywhere. And thus, by late 1990s, it was obvious that there was new kinds of wars, new kind of divisions coming up. But it was only in this century that you could see a rivalry on the same level. So you could say that for, say, 15 years or so, United States was the only great power in the world, and it was desperately trying to keep its circus together, but it couldn't. It didn't have that kind of power. And now it's becoming more complicated when we have China, especially China. So China and the United States. China wants to see itself in parity with the United States, but United States used to be a world power. And great powers never give up anything freely. So in order to China to have a saying in the world, United States will have to back down, and we'll see whether this happens peacefully or not. It has usually not done so. But there is one thing that has changed in world politics during the last 80 years, and that's nuclear weapons. Nowadays, great powers can't afford waging wars against each other anymore. They are using proxy wars, like the Ukrainian war. In the olden times, it's very likely that the Ukrainian war would have become a world war, that NATO, the West, would have backed Ukraine by force. But that would be nuclear war. And no, nobody is going to choose nuclear war, not even Vladimir Putin. There cannot be victory, a winner. There cannot be anything to be gained by nuclear war. So Ukraine war is being fought in the same way as Vietnam War was, or the first Afghanistan war against Soviet Union. That one of the powers, in this case Russia, is fighting a country which is supported by the other side, in this case NATO. So from the point of view of the great power struggle, Ukrainian war is a proxy war, of which the Ukrainians, of course, are the sufferers. One side is trying to conquer them, and NATO is trying to prevent them to be conquered. I don't think Western powers, especially countries like United States, France, or Germany, are really seriously thinking of Ukraine being able to retake lost territories. That will mean a very long war, very costly war. Ukrainians are the weaker side, and the weaker side is very unlikely to be able to take any more territory. There hasn't been any change in the fronts anymore during the last year. The last time something happened was the surprising Ukrainian success during November last year, when the Kharkov area was retaken. But Russians have had now a long time to prepare their lines. Their military, their production is now working much better. And I have noticed that President Biden's administration is always using the same line of support for Ukraine. We will support Ukraine as long as Ukraine wants it. They have never said that they will defend Ukraine as to regain its former borders. So, if one would prophesy, perhaps a year from now, we have already seen signs of the Western powers trying to make some kind of ceasefire in Ukraine. They are trying to find a position where it's so obvious that nobody is going to go anywhere in those fronts anymore, that there would be a ceasefire, and that would of course mean loss for Ukraine. It would really become, in that case, it would really be a winter war. It's strange that this analogy has been so much used, even here in Finland, that the Ukrainians are fighting their own winter war. We lost the winter war. My mother was born in Käkisalmi. She didn't want to lose her hometown. We lost the war. So if Ukrainian war is going to be another winter war, it means Ukraine will lose. And currently it looks like that. Again, I would be very happy if not. But from point of view of real politics, of what seems to be happening, I can't see an option in which Ukraine would be winning. This I prophesied already last year in this same presentation. Okay, so Russia and NATO are fighting now a proxy competition over spheres of influence in Europe. It looks rather nasty, and I'm not saying that Russia is not to blame. It attacked Ukraine without any provocation. Of course it is, but still, from the point of view of great powers, it's a proxy war. And China and USA have this problem of there being not enough place in this world for the two of them. There can't be two sheriffs in one town. And it will be seen how they try to find some kind of room to live together. And if we are following the old formula of how this kind of situations develop, they usually develop into military blocs, like Finland now joining NATO, which means that there will be increased mutual fear as they currently are, is also in Finland. Increasing militarization, again, we are feeling that as well, arms competition. One side decides to put more money on arms or create a new regiment somewhere, then the other side does the same, and then one side does it again. And that's how this game always is played. Military alliances are not for peace. Both world wars started between alliances, military alliances. Military alliances, in a peaceful world, there would not be military alliances. Military alliances are always dangerous, and it doesn't matter what they call themselves, even if they call themselves defensive alliances. NATO has never fought in defense of its own territory. It has had 4 wars, which have always been outside its territory. It is a military alliance which tries to portray military power to support political objectives. Bosnia war, Kosovo war, Libya, and then Afghanistan. 4 wars, all of them outside NATO. And the stronger NATO gets, the more likely it gets that Russia and China will make an alliance, because they will see themselves as having no other choice, because the other side is getting stronger. There is always this problem when we are thinking of security and peace terms, that we are forgetting that it doesn't look the same from the other side. If the Russian government would see themselves as crooks, they would not act that way. Of course, they don't see it that way. And it doesn't matter what way we see them. It only matters how they see themselves. And they are increasingly seeing us as a threat to them. But of course, in a way, it's very understandable. We are sending guns and ammunition to Ukrainians to kill Russian soldiers. We are very hostile to Russia, for a good reason. But of course, from the Russian point of view, we are not really a friendly nation. We are really hostile nation towards Russia from their point of view, because that's what we are doing. They are not killing us. We are killing them through proxies. So, this was something which was already referred to, that there is this fear of trade sanctions and also the increasing effect of climate change, which is accelerating protectionism in the world. During the last 10 years, there has been an increasing, very rapid rise of protectionist laws all over the world. And of course, sanctions are also protectionist. I hope this is the last one. Let's see. Fine. So, I'm in time. This is now turning the eye outside the great powers, because as noted, this, and not even the Cold War of the old, this is a saying that from that time, tail wags the dog. And it meant that in many cases it was the secondary countries who were running the shots during the Cold War, and not United States and Soviet Union. You could always play them against each other. If you don't give us money and guns, we will go to the other side. This kind of blackmail worked very well during the Cold War, and there is no reason to believe that this wouldn't be the case as well. Whatever alliances are being made are not made due to goodwill or due to belief in same kinds of belief systems. It's from your own profit. Perhaps the most important case like this during the last 2 years is him, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is actually running the government of Saudi Arabia, which is still one of the most important countries in the world because of its role in energy production, oil production. Saudi Arabia was created in 1930s in a kind of a symbiosis with the United States from the beginning. Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, originally meant Arabian American company. It was part owned by the United States. It was only bought out by the Saudis in 1980s. Saudi Arabia has always been consistently close allies to the United States because the United States has been the main buyer of its oil. But it's no longer that. The United States is becoming more and more self-reliant on energy production, and the West is becoming less and less accepting of the social system, of the way the Saudis are running their own country, of this very traditional way of treating, for example, women again. So from his point of view, United States is no longer a reliable ally. And during the last 2 years, there has been a kind of a diplomatic revolution where he has been siding now more and more with China. And this is a big thing, actually. It's probably the greatest diplomatic difference in the world during these 2 years, although it has received rather little notice. But increasingly, Saudi Arabia is now leaning towards China, and it's becoming rather cold against the United States. There was at least a rumor a year ago that he hung up when President Biden was trying to call. That would have never happened before in Saudi Arabia. But from his point of view, China is a better ally. And China doesn't care in which way he treats his own people in his own country. And also, leaning towards China means that the Americas will be backing you, so you can play them against each other. So people like him are now kind of the stars of our modern struggle for power. People who are playing countries against each other. There is another, President Erdogan of Turkey, who has been brilliant in somehow tightroping in the Ukrainian war, being supporter of both sides, an ally of Russia and a part of NATO. And he has done it successfully. Nobody dares to criticize him, because then you would be pushing him to the other side. Everybody is beckoning him to their own side. And he has benefited from this greatly. And he is still holding Sweden as a hostage for his own power struggle, because he can. Nobody is going to criticize him too greatly for Sweden, because then he would go to the other side. He cannot, he's untouchable at the moment. Also, Turkey is now much more important economically and politically as before, so it has more chips to play. Rise of local political struggles. In Middle East, nowadays, you have Turkey, you have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia. They all have their own proxies and their own proxy wars. They are waging a great power war in their own surroundings, like in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is supporting one side in a civil war and Iran another side. They are not facing each other, but they are both supporting their side in a proxy war, of which really neither of them are very interested in what's happening there. The important thing is the war itself against the other side. West handicapped against, by imperial past. Yes, well, actually, I already told about that. This is the latest military coup that succeeded in Niger a few months ago. After that, there has been attempts twice in Sierra Leone, once in Guinea-Bissau, but they haven't so far succeeded. These military coups leading to young officers taking power and the people cheering with Russian flags is becoming ever more prevalent, especially in Western Africa. You now have that in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and now lately in Niger, of which Niger is by far the most important. Actually, the loss of Niger means the end of French empire in Africa. The French are still thinking themselves as great power because they have a kind of their area of their own in Western Africa. They still have military bases there. They have much economic relations, but they are now being kicked out of them. Niger being the most important because they have uranium, very important uranium mines. And it will be seen what happens to these mines now. Why Russia? Why are they supporting Russia? What they have to do with Russia? Well, for the first thing, in many African countries, it's still remembered that Soviet Union supported the anti-imperialist struggle in 1950s and 1960s. They still remember this warmly, and Russia is seen as a follower there. But mainly it's not because they will be for Russia, but they are against the West. More or less what they are saying in their own social media is that, okay, we don't know the Russians, maybe they are crooks, but we know what the French are like. Anything is better than the French. And let's the Russians have now their chance. And this is what Russia is using very profitably for itself. Its military power, Wagner, in Africa, to make itself the third great power in Africa. These all are Russian military presence and installations. I think I am using my time up here, and but I think that was more or less all. Thank you.
Thank you, Risto. This was really interesting. Let's now hold a 15-minute break and then continue with the panel discussion.